So remember that in the beginning when we started with our first model, what did we say? We said that it was a real economy, right? What did that mean? That means that everything was in real terms. So in terms of a good. So whenever we're talking about GDP or income or spending, everything was in terms of goods. The same with when we talked about the open economy, everything was in terms of goods, right? However, what we're going to do is now we're going to introduce money into our model to see how money affects the economy in the long run, right? So, just as any market, we're going to have the money supply and the money demand, right? First of all, what is money? Well, money is a stock of assets that can be readily used to make transactions. So, what are some functions of money? The functions of money is that it's a store of value. So that means that if I have a $100 bill, that $100 bill is storing $100 of value, right? So it has some intrinsic value associated with it. Sorry, it's a unit of account. Unit of account because why? Well, because I can count it, right? So I can measure things in terms of dollars. That's why it's a unit of account. And medium of exchange. Why? Because, well, now if I have $100, well, if I have $10, then I can go to the coffee shop and buy some coffee, right? So I can exchange my money for goods. So it's a medium of exchange. What are the two types of money? Well, we have fiat money and commodity money. Fiat money is money that has no intrinsic value. It is established as money by the government or by decree. What does that mean? How much do you think it costs to produce a dollar bill? Do you think it's worth the value of $1 bill? The cost of production of $1 bill, is it $1? No, right? It's way cheaper. So how is it possible that that $1 bill has actually a value of $1? Well, it's because the government, right? The government supports that value. The government tells you this bill is going to have a value of $1. But intrinsically, the little piece of paper doesn't have any power, right? It's just because it's backed by the government, right? Yes? Okay. If you see in your, I don't have any bills today. I'm poor. If you see in your bills, it says paid to the order of, right? So it's the central bank. It's actually he owns you that dollar, right? Yeah. Very good. The other type of money is commodity money. So that one's easy. Commodity money is use of a commodity as value as money, or a claim on some valuable item as money. So the most common example was the gold standard, right? So before we had fiat money, we had the gold standard. All the currencies were tied with the amount of gold that it had. So we had, for example, gold coins, right? The value is not because the government is saying, oh, this gold coin has some value, right? It's because gold has already a value, so it has some intrinsic value, right? Do you guys agree? Very good. So how are we going to measure money? First of all, who is in charge of monetary policy? Very good, the central bank, not the government, okay? In the beginning, when central banks started, the first central bank was established in England. When central banks started, they were pretty close, right? What's the problem with having a government and a central bank that are pretty close, that are managed by the same people? Well, the problem is that you can just use the central bank as your personal bank, right? You say, oh, just print as much money as I need, right? And then we're going to see what are the implications of just printing money, right? Just because I need it. Very good. So we have to always keep separate the government and the central bank. In the exam, you say the government implements a monetary policy. I'll cross out the whole question, right? Because that, I mean, as I told you, I work for a central bank in Mexico, so it would be like stabbed my heart. So the central bank is in charge of monetary policy, right? What is monetary policy? Monetary policy is exactly using the money supply, right, to affect the economic variables, right? But first we need to know how to measure the money supply. So when you think about money supply, what do you think? It's just exactly the quantity of bills, right, that are circulating in the economy, right? But not only that. I have currency, which is the sum of outstanding paper, money, and coins. And I also have demand deposits. What are demand deposits? Demand deposits are funds that people hold in their checking accounts, right? Why would that also be part of the money supply? Well, I have some money, and I go to Bank of America and I deposit it. What does Bank of America do? Sorry? Very good. It invested, for example, they can invest in the stock market, or they can lend it to someone else, right? And then in that way, that person, now what? Now that person that has more money, right? So that means that in our economy, we not only care about how many bills are actually printed, but also how much funds people have in their checking accounts, right? Why? Because that money I can close my checking account anytime that I want, right? Do you agree? So that's also part of how much money there is in the economy, right? So currency plus demand deposits. And demand deposits is just the value, it's how much money you have in your checking accounts, right? Remember, we want to know, we want to measure the stock of assets that can be readily used to make transactions, right? So the more liquid assets. So our first and most important formula for the money supply is currency plus demand deposits. So, in real life, so if you look at like measures of money in the internet, you're going to see that there's not only currency plus demand deposit, but there are different measures of money, and those measures depend on how liquid the asset that I'm talking about, that I'm including in that measure is, right? So, for example, do you agree that currency is the most liquid asset? When I'm saying liquid asset, what do I mean? Very good. How easy it is for me to use that asset to convert into, for example, into goods, right? Yeah? So if I go to the store with my $1 bill, I immediately can get money back, right? With my checking account, the same. I would just use my debit card, right? My debit card, I would just buy some good, right? Would you agree that I cannot go to the UCLA store and take out my 30-year treasury bond for the government and then buy a computer, right? I cannot do that. That asset is less liquid. In particular, if it's a 30-year bond, that means that I have to wait 30 years in order to cash it, right? Yeah? Very good. So, we have different measures of money. The first one is currency. The second one is M1. So M1 is exactly this one. It's similar to the one that we have. So it's just currency plus demand deposit plus, for example, traveler's checks and other checkable deposits, right? Traveler's checks are also very liquid, right? Then we have M2. So M2, it would be all the other from above plus mutual funds, saving deposits, and small time deposits, right? Why save? So what's the difference between your checking account and your savings account? Your savings account is a little bit less liquid. I mean, I can access my money quickly, but when I'm using my debit card, it doesn't take away funds from my savings account. It takes funds from my checking account, right? In order for me to be able to access my funds from the savings account, I would need to take money out from the savings account, put it in the checking account, and then I use that money, right? Yeah? Do you agree? Very good. Well, I mean, unless you go to the ATM and then take money out of the savings account, right? But with the debit card, it only accesses your checking account, right? So it's a little bit less liquid, right? So, for example, we have M3, then we would have short-term bonds. M4 includes long-term bonds. All of those are assets, right? All of those are money. So, for example, your house, it's also part of your assets. It can use to make transactions, but that's not very liquid, right? It's very not liquid. Because then I would have to first sell the house, change the name, right? Do you agree? Good or not very good? Confusing? So it has to do with how easy it is to transform that asset into goods in this case, right? The different measures of wealth. So now that we know how to measure our money supply, which we said it was just currency plus demand deposits, now we're going to see who manages that money. In particular, the one that manages the money are banks, and the head of all banks is the central bank, right? So the definition of the central bank is just a central bank, a reserve bank, or monetary authority is an institution that manages a state's currency, money supply, and interest rates, right? So that means that the central bank is the one that chooses the interest rate, right? So for example, in the US, the interest rate right now is
0.07%.
Sorry?
0.07%.
Very good. So it's in a range between 0 and 0.125, right? Very good. How long has it been in that level?
Several years.
Yeah, very good, like 2-3 years, right? When the crisis started, it started reducing the interest rate, and now they're stuck there for about 3 years. Very good. So the central banks have different names throughout the whole countries, right? So the central bank of the United States is the Federal Reserve, right? Most of them are just Central Bank of Mexico. But we also have, they're also called reserve banks, right? So for example, the one in Australia and New Zealand is the Reserve Bank of Australia and Reserve Bank of New Zealand, right? Why are they called reserve banks? Why do you think they are called reserve banks? What happens if suddenly Bank of America runs out of funds? Everyone just wants to take out their money and they just lend it to someone else. Who do you think Bank of America is going to borrow from? Very good. From the Fed, right? They're not going to ask the government. Well, I mean, not unless they default and we have the crisis. But don't think about that. Think about it as the central bank is the lender of last resort for banks, right? If they want to borrow money, they would go to the central bank, right? Do you agree? Very good. So, just as any firm, we're going to have the balance sheet of a bank, and it's divided between assets and liabilities, right? Assets are the things that I own, and liabilities are the things that I owe, right? So, person comes into my bank, they give me their money, and I put it in my bank vault, right? Those deposits are liabilities, right? Now, once those deposits, I can either keep them in my bank, or what can I do with those deposits? I can actually put them in the central bank as reserves, right? So the central bank can take care of that money as reserves. And in that case, those reserves are going to be part of my assets, right? Because now the central bank owes me that money. Do you agree? Yeah? Very good. What are liability? Well, if I want to open my bank, well, maybe I took out some debt, right? I asked for a loan, and then that's how I open my bank. So other part of liability is debt. What did I say I can do with that, with those deposits that people deposit in my bank? Well, I can either hold them as reserves in the central bank, right? Because the way that you can think about it, I know that maybe, so, I don't know, well, what do you guys think of banks? They always show in movies, like, right, that they have like this big vault filled with cash and money, right? In reality, that's not very functional, right? But they have a small amount of money, but most of the reserves are in the central bank, right? And not actually in the central bank. The central bank uses them, right, for monetary policy, but but those are part of the bank, right? So once I deposit my money, the bank can either hold those deposits as reserves, or they can give out loans, right? And those loans are part of the assets of the central bank, right? Because now those people owe me money, right? Finally, we have securities. So securities is just, again, if I have that money, I can also use it to buy bonds, right? Government bonds. So that's the most common example, is going to be government bonds. Government bonds is just buying part of government debt, right? So the government issues a bond saying that I'll pay this quantity of money once the term expires, right? So that's just a bond, right? Yeah? Have you heard the term bond before? Yeah? In the news, so it's the T-bills, those are just government bonds, right? Yeah? Very good. Finally, So before the crisis, when we didn't used to study money, we actually didn't analyze this part very much, the owner's equity. Owner's equity just means, so in order for me to open my bank, I had to get together some investors, right, or maybe some owners of the bank, and then they put some capital, right, in order to establish the bank, right? So the owner's equity is part of the liabilities of the central bank, of the bank, right? Yep. Now, why is it important to have owner's equity? Again, it's because that part is going to help me whenever people want to take out their money, right? If people want to withdraw their deposits and I don't have any money, then I would use part of the owner's equity to give them their money back, right? Do you agree? A little bit? Or what is it? So what happened? Yeah.
Could you explain again owner's equity?
Sure. So in order, for example, to establish a firm, you first would need capital, right? So that means that someone has to put part of their money in order to establish that firm. In this case, it would be in terms of banks. It's people put their money together in order to establish the bank, right? In order to have the bank. That money that they put, right? It's them. They own that money, right? But they're going to use that money in order to start making loans, right? In order to make loans to other people, and then that way other people can make deposits in their bank, right? So it's a liability because they don't actually own it, right? The bank doesn't own it. The shareholders own it. And it's because I'm going to use part of the owner's equity in order to pay my clients in case that I don't have any reserves. Maybe I loaned everything, right? So I would use part of the owner's equity to pay them. Make sense? Yeah. So, what is the leverage ratio? The leverage ratio is the ratio of the bank's total assets to bank capital. It shows the assets of the bank for every dollar of capital that the bank owners have contributed. The remaining parts of the assets are supported by borrowed money, hence comes the term leverage. Right? So, the ratio of the bank's total assets to bank capital, and it shows the assets of the bank for every dollar of capital that the bank owners have contributed. Is that definition clear? So, if my assets, let's suppose that here, all the assets are 100, right? Yeah? And the owner's equity is only 10. How did I get all the rest? How did I get the other 90? Borrowing, right? So those 90 are exactly the amount that I have borrowed. That's part of borrowed money, right? Yeah. Why is it important then to have a leverage ratio? What would be in a perfect world? What would be the leverage ratio? 1. Very good. Why?
Because no money would borrow.
No money would be borrowed, and every part of your assets would be backed by some part of the owner's capital, right? Very good. That's very good. Yeah. So the leverage ratio just tells me, okay, so from all of my assets, what's the proportion that's backed by my owner's capital, and what's the proportion that's actually borrowed, right? So in case that there's some sort of crisis, and then people take out their reserves, so they cannot pay their loans, right? They default on their loans, then I can use that owner's capital in order to pay my liabilities, right? If my leverage ratio is really high, then I'm fine, right? But if my leverage ratio is really low, that means that most of my money is borrowed. Most of my assets, the value of my assets, is because I borrowed money, right? And then I won't be able to support it, right? In case of a crisis. So think again about the financial crisis. That's exactly what happened, right? People started to default on their loans, and the banks did not have a good leverage ratio, and that's when it started to everything started to crash. Right? Make sense? If you're not understanding, just let me know. Yeah? Okay. So the remaining parts of the assets are supported by borrow money, hence comes the term leverage. Okay. So we're going to have our first model of the money supply. We already said that now that we have banks in our model, people are going to work, right? They're going to receive their wages in terms of money. They go and deposit their money in the bank. The bank then can lend that money, right? The bank lends that money, and in that way they're generating more money, right? So for our model of the money supply, we're going to have 4 more definitions. The monetary base, the reserve deposit ratio, the currency deposit ratio, and the money multiplier. The monetary base is the total number of dollars held by the public as currency and by the banks as reserves. And this is directly controlled by the central bank, right? So the monetary base, it's another name for the monetary base is high power money. This one is actually, you could think about it as of the total number of bills, right, printed in the economy, right? Because it's just currency plus the reserves, right? It doesn't take into account how much more money is being generated by the deposits. Do you agree? Yeah? And this one is controlled by the central bank. How is it controlled by the central bank? Well, the currency, the central bank is the one, not that one's true, right? The central bank is the one that has the actual printing press for the money, right? So they have the factories of money. Have you ever been to a coining mint? Coining mint? Right? Yeah. Have you ever been to a coining mint? No? Would they coin? Mint the coins? Mint the coins? So they have different factories where they actually do that, right? They print the money, right? So the central bank can just say one day the president of the central bank can just wake up one day and say, I just want to print a lot of money, and then wakes up and turns on the machine and prints a lot of money, right? They can do that. Do you agree? They control the amount of bills that are in the economy. And reserves, how can the central bank control the reserves? Well, it's because they can actually require a specific proportion of reserves. Do you agree that a bank that doesn't have reserves, that bank is obviously going to crash, right? I must have a certain amount of reserves. If I don't have reserves, then whenever my clients come for their money, I don't have any money, then of course it's going to be. So what happens if you go to Bank of America and say, hey, I want to take out my money, and they don't give it to you? What would you do? You would tell all your friends, right? Hey, so Bank of America doesn't want to give me your money. So what do? Everyone goes to Bank of America and tries to get out their money. And then what we have, it's a bank run. So that's the name of it, right? The bank run. So, of course, the bank, what he would like is just to loan everything that they have, right? That way they could generate more money because then they're making more interest. But in order to have a healthy financial system, we must have a certain amount of reserve, right? And the central bank can specify the amount of reserves that banks should have. Okay? We have the reserve to deposit ratio, which is exactly the central bank controls. It's just a fraction of deposits that banks hold in reserve. It's determined by the business policies of banks and by the laws regulating banks. So the central bank can establish a minimum reserve, but the bank can also choose to have a certain amount of reserves, right? So that one's controlled by the central bank or the banks. The currency to deposit ratio, it's the amount of currency people hold as a fraction of their holdings of demand deposits. It reflects the preferences of households about the form of money they wish to hold, right? Currency to deposit ratio. So that is how much money you have in your wallet compared to how much money you have in your bank account. Yeah? And finally, we have the money multiplier. The money multiplier is the factor of proportionality that shows how many dollars of money each dollar of the monetary base produces. So that's the interesting part. What happens if I print one more dollar? If I print one more dollar and then I just give it to you, you will go take that dollar and put it in your bank, right? Deposit it in your bank. The bank takes that dollar, and part of it is going to use it as reserve, and part of it is going to loan it to someone else, right? And then that loan gives it as money to someone else. That someone else goes to their bank and deposits that money, right? Deposit that money, the bank decides what part to hold as reserve or what part as loans, right? And then the story continues until I have a total effect, right? So that means that for each dollar that I increase, in this case for currency, I'm going to have that the impact in the money supply is not going to be 1, right? It's going to be greater than 1. And that factor of proportionality is going to be given by the money multiplier, which we're going to derive right now. Yeah? Reserves will work the opposite way. For every dollar that I decide to increase my reserve, then I'm taking money away from the economy, right? Yeah? Good. So, exercise 1.1, using the definitions from above, show that the money supply equals the money multiplier times the monetary base. So, how are we going to start? So we said that the monetary base is actually currency plus reserves, right? So if I divide the money supply and the monetary base, I would have currency plus deposits over currency plus reserves, right? Now what do you think I should do? I know that at some point I'm going to have to use the currency to deposit ratio and the reserve deposit ratio, right? So why don't I just divide by R, divide by R, divide by R, divide by R. That doesn't affect my equation, right? If I do it in all the variables, it's not going to affect my equation. So I have MS over B equals C over R plus D over R over C over R plus R over R. This is just the currency to deposit ratio. This is just the reserve. This is the deposit to reserve ratio. This is the currency to reserve ratio, and this is just 1, right? Yeah? Yeah? Well, I know it's Friday. Are you guys sure? That doesn't make sense. I shouldn't be dividing by R, I should be dividing by sorry? D, very good. The currency to reserve ratio, that's not make sense. I have to be dividing by D, not by R. So it's, sorry. It wasn't making sense. That's good. So, remember it's the currency to deposit ratio, not to reserve, currency to deposit ratio, and the reserve to deposit ratio. So what do I have? I have that the money supply equals the currency to deposit ratio plus 1 over the currency to deposit ratio plus the reserve ratio times the monetary base, right? So, what does that? What is that? What is that ratio exactly? Very good. That's the money multiplier. This is M, the money multiplier. Right? Tells me for every dollar that I increase in the monetary base, how much the money supply is going to increase, right? So it's a factor of proportionality that I would multiply to obtain the money supply, right? Yeah. Thank you. Okay. What are the instruments of monetary policy? So, the easiest way would be just to say the bank prints out bills, right? And they just give it to everyone in the economy, right? That would be a helicopter drop. I don't know if you have heard of that term before, helicopter drop. That's the way that economists used to introduce money into the economy before. What they said is just like the central bank prints money, they fly a helicopter around the city and they just drop the money. And that's the way that they give it to people, right? That doesn't happen in real life, right? So in real life, what do we have? The central bank can either affect the monetary base or the reserve to deposit ratio. Changes in the monetary base would be by affecting what? Either currency or reserves, right? It's different to affect the reserves than to affect the reserve to deposit ratio. Do you see the difference? Yeah? So, how can I change the monetary base? I already said that once the government, they can issue bonds, right? Those bonds are part of their debt. And who buys those bonds? The central bank, right? So whenever the central bank buys or sells bonds, it's called an open market operation, and that way we can affect the currency circulation. How? Well, suppose I hold some government bonds, right, from the US. I have some treasury bills, and then what happens if I sell you those bonds? So if I sell you those bonds, now you hold those bonds and you give me currency, very good. So the money supply would, would decrease, right? Make sense? What happens if instead I say, hey, I'm going to buy your bonds. So I buy your bonds, and what do I give you in return? Money. So what would happen to the money supply? It would increase, right? Very good. So the open market operations are just purchase and sales of government bonds by the central bank. As I said, whenever banks need to borrow money, they go straight to the central bank, right? The central bank would have the lowest rate. The rate at which the central bank loans to other banks is called the discount rate. Okay? So what would happen if the discount rate increases?
It would be more expensive to borrow money.
Very good. So
People would borrow less.
to not people, banks,
Banks
right?
would
Banks.
borrow less.
So banks would borrow less, so they will hold more
In reserve.
more reserves. Does that make sense? What happens if the central bank says, oh, I can lend you at a 0 interest rate? Then I wouldn't have any reserves, right? Because any time that I would need money, I would just borrow from the central bank, right? In order to pay whenever people make deposits. Yeah.
I mean, it's not any time you want. It's when you're having some kind of a solvency situation and it's an emergency.
No.
Isn't it an overnight kind of a
No.
situation?
So with the discount rate, you can borrow whenever you want. That's why it's not 0, right? For the discount rate,
I think you're talking about the overnight rate.
you're talking about the term auctions facilities, different types of other other things that so for example the term auction facilities, the central bank sets a quantity of funds it wants to lend to banks, right? So in that case it's an auction, right? They say I'm going to lend this quantity, and then they say at what price they're going to sell it, right?
Yeah.
So I know I know that they never, it's not that they can always borrow from the central bank at any time that they want, right? But it has to do with the value of the interest rate. If the discount rate is really low, then banks are going to hold less reserves than if the discount rate was higher, right? Make sense? That's the whole point. So just to say, what happens if the central bank decides to increase the discount rate? Then banks would hold more reserves, and the money supply would go down. There would be a lower money supply, right? Make sense? Great. So the discount rate has to do with the price, and the term auction facility has to do with quantity. Now instead of saying what's the price at which they're borrowing funds, they're saying this is the quantity that I'm going to borrow to other banks, right? So those are changes in the monetary base because they affect either currency or reserves, right? And changes in reserve requirements, right, in RR, those affect the money multiplier, right? That means that whenever one of the three at the top changes, the money multiplier stays the same. For the ones on the bottom, reserve requirement and the interest rate on reserves, those are going to change the money multiplier. So reserve requirements, again, is just the central bank can specify how much, what's the proportion that banks should have as reserves. And the interest on reserves, because we said this, the banks actually give the reserves at the central bank, and the central bank pays them for those reserves, some interest rate. So if that interest rate went up, then I would want to have more part of my reserves in the central bank. That would lower the money supply, right? Great. So that was just an overview. Now we're going to do the exercise, and we're going to finish with a table to see what happens to all the variables whenever I change those, whenever I use any of those instruments of monetary policy. So exercise 1.2. In Springfield, Major Joseph Quimby is the head of the central bank. Explain how each of the following events affects the money supply in Springfield. Determine whether the change is through the money multiplier or the monetary base. Is everything clear up till now, or not that much? Sounds complicated, but it's not that complicated. So it has to do with definitions, knowing what definitions are, right? Knowing how to measure the money supply, knowing what's the difference between the money supply and the monetary base, right? And finally, it's knowing what's the impact of the instruments of monetary policy on the money supply, right? Very good. So we're going to have our change, right? What's going to be the effect on the money supply, the effect on the monetary base, the effect on the money multiplier, the effect on the currency to reserve ratio, and the effect currency to deposit ratio, and the effect on the reserve to deposit ratio. So, one, Major Quimby buys government bonds in an open market operation. So if the head of the central bank buys government bonds, what would that increase? Currency increases because he's buying, right? Very good. So currency is going to increase. just wanted to put here the formulas. Money supply equals currency plus deposit. The monetary base is currency plus reserves. The money multiplier is the currency to reserve ratio plus 1, take it, over the currency to reserve ratio plus the reserve to RR, right? Very good. So, if currency increases, what happens to the money supply? Increases. Very good. What happens to the monetary base? It's also increased, right? Very good. What happens to the money multiplier? Nothing, right? The currency to reserve ratio, the currency to deposit ratio, is determined by households, right? So even if the central bank decides to buy government bonds and then give more money to the economy, the fraction of the proportion of currency to deposit that you hold doesn't change. That's determined by your preferences of how much money you want to hold, right? Yeah. And the reserve to deposit ratio is a decision of the bank or determined by specifically by the central bank, right? But in this case, it hasn't changed. None of those preferences have changed, right? The law hasn't changed, and preferences of banks or households haven't changed. So the money multiplier should not change, right? Major Quimby increases the interest rate. Remember that Major Quimby is the head of the central bank. The head of the central bank increases the interest rate it pays banks for holding reserves. So we said that that's going to affect actually the proportion. So what's the difference between the discount rate and the interest on reserves? The discount rate, so what Matt said, but wait, it's just only when they have solvency problems, right? It means that the banks don't always ask for money from the central bank, right? They only do it in case, or that they want to increase maybe their capital, they want to give more loans. So it's in special events, right? Special occasions. But the interest on reserves, that's actually going to change the proportion of reserves to deposits that you hold, right? Because now it's going to be paid on the whole amount of reserves. So that's why it's different. Yeah? So interest on reserves is going to affect directly the reserve to deposit ratio because it's going to change my preferences. It's going to incentivize that I hold more reserve, right? So increases the interest rate, it pays banks for holding reserves. So I increase the interest on reserves. It's as if I'm increasing the reserve to deposit ratio, right? I want to hold proportionally more reserves at the central bank, right? Yeah? What?
What about opportunity costs?
Oh.
Would you get a higher rate of interest from loaning than you would from the interest paid to you on your excess reserves?
The problem is that that's risky, right? They can default on their loan. So it's just an incentive. So they wouldn't hold everything as reserve, right? What I'm saying is just that the proportion would increase because now you have a safer asset that's paying you a higher return. So you would put more reserves in the central bank, right? Makes sense. So I don't say that they stop making loans. It's more like they increase the proportion of their deposits that they hold as reserves. Huh?
Then you say the central bank sets the reserve ratio.
Oh yeah, so they could also just set the reserve ratio, right? But one way they could increase it is just using the interest paid on reserves, right?
So the reserve ratio set by the central bank isn't a law; it's just a recommendation.
Sometimes it's a law. So here in the US, I think it wasn't a law, then it was a law, then it wasn't a law, right? But so there's some central banks that recommend it, and there's central banks that actually impose it. So Colombia, for example, yeah.
Does that mean like the reserve ratio is kind of the bottom line and it's gonna in the long run you have to hold the reserve?
Yeah. But so the thing is that one is the reserve to deposit ratio, and the other thing is reserve requirements. So reserve requirements are are imposed by the central bank. The central bank tells that you have to hold this type, or recommends them to have this proportion, right? And reserve to deposit is maybe, so the central bank might recommend you have just a half, right? But maybe you have even more because you very risk averse. So you want to hold more reserves, right? So they're not always equal to each other, right? The bank might decide to have it a little bit more, but it's a decision that depends both on the banks and the central bank. Make sense? So okay, the reserve to deposit ratio increases. So it's in the denominator. So that increases. What happens to the money multiplier? Decreases. So what happens to the money supply? Decreases, right? What happens to the currency to deposit ratio? Nothing. Remember, this one is, that one is only, it's a decision by households. If you read the newspaper that the central bank is increasing the interest rate that they pay banks on reserves, would that change the proportion of money that you hold in your pocket? No, right? Something else has to happen in order to change that preference, right? But it's not related with how much the central bank is paying. And finally, what happens to the monetary base? So now that we're holding, so now they're paying a higher interest rate, that means that I'm going to hold more reserves. What's the formula for the monetary base? Currency per reserves, right? So what happens to the monetary base? Increases, right? So there's more high power money, right? There are more reserves, but the problem is that those reserves are generating less money because I'm holding a higher proportion of them in the bank instead of lending them to other people, right? So the effect of the money multiplier, it's always greater than the effect of the monetary base, right? Remember, the one that's generating all the money is because I'm able to loan it to other people and they can deposit it in the bank again, right? If I'm holding more reserves, then the money supply is going to be lower, right? Hmm? Do you have a question?
I don't understand why the money supply decreases.
The money supply decreases because the money multiplier now is lower, right? Now the money supply is also M times the monetary base, right? So if you hold more reserves, now the central bank, you make less loans, right? So since you're making less loans, people make less deposits. Make sense? Yeah? Very good. Mm-hmm.
When the reserve increase, wouldn't the currency also decrease because
Currency are the bills that are printed, right? So it does not, it's not decreasing, right? Major QMB reduces the lending rate at which it lends to banks. That affects, so the first thing that you have to think is, does it affect the monetary base or the money multiplier, right? Does it affect the money multiplier? No. Right? So, doesn't affect the money multiplier, that means that these two stay constant, right? what is changing? So it says, so he's reducing the lending rate, so he's reducing the discount rate, the rate at which the central bank loans to commercial banks. So that means that now I'm going to have,
That's currency.
I'm going to make more loans, right? Makes sense. Yeah? If I lower the rate at which I'm lending to other banks, then that means that I can go straight to the central bank and ask for a loan in order to loan to households, right? So I loan to households, and by loaning to households, I'm increasing the money supply, right? I will increase the quantity of reserves and of money, so the monetary base increases, and the money supply increases. Whenever they offer you a credit with a very low interest rate, well, you take it, right? What do you do with that credit? Do you just spend it like crazy? No, right? Part of it you spend it, part of it you would save it. So in terms of a bank, it would be part of it you would loan it to other people, and part of it you would hold it as reserves, right? Make sense? Yeah?
So if he reduced the lending, he increased the lending rate, the money supply would increase?
The money supply would decrease.
No, if he increased the lending rate.
The money supply would decrease.
Oh, okay.
Yeah? Because now you make less loans, right? You borrow less from the central bank. Rumors about a possible meltdown of Springfield's nuclear power plant increases the amount of money people hold as currency relative to the demand deposits. That would change the currency to reserve ratio, currency to deposit ratio. The R is throwing me off. That's why I'm saying before. So the currency to deposit ratio, right? It would go up. If the currency to deposit ratio goes up, what happens to the money supply? So is it a change to the base or to the multiplier? No, it's only through the multiplier, right? Because now it's a decision from the households, right? So the money multiplier is lower, so the money supply is lower. And nothing happens to the monetary base.